Ladies and gentlemen, an interesting term appeared in the headlines this past week, and that term was solar lockdown. It came out of a number of different media operations, among them Forbes, who announced the sun is asleep. A deep solar minimum is feared as 2020 sees a record-setting 100-day slump. Well, goodness, this sounds like news. We need to be afraid. We're breaking records. Oh, what's going on? Let's check it out. While we on Earth suffer from coronavirus, our star, the sun, is having a lockdown all of its own. Interesting to see them conflate a solar minimum with a response to a pandemic. But let's go on. 2020 becomes the second consecutive year of a record-setting low number of sunspots. Well, wait a minute. Why are we only hearing about this now, Forbes? Why weren't we talking about this last year? I was. Where were you? What's changed between then and now? And furthermore, what is it we need to be afraid of? Because if you read the rest of the article, all it talks about is how we'll be able to see the northern lights and probably be able to see some eclipses too. And then the article ends. There's nothing to be feared that's talked about here. What kind of trash is that to say that we should be afraid, but not even tell us why? These are some pretty important questions, and I think they deserve answers. Let's talk about it. I'm Christian, and this is the Ice Age Farmer broadcast. Just like Forbes invoked the solar lockdown language and said we should be afraid, but didn't tell us why, a myriad of different media operations with different audiences, different topics, different demographics that wanted to reach everyone, used the same language exactly. It's the telltale sign that the CIA Mockingbird media was invoked, that they spun the engine into operation and shot out these talking points that were then parroted by a bunch of different rags. Let's take a quick look through those. The sun has entered a lockdown period, which could cause freezing weather and famine. I will also note this is the first time there have been some discussions of solar minimum in previous media coverage over the last few years, but never would they actually talk about famine. From the Daily Star, scientists warn of freezing weather, famine, and earthquakes as the sun goes into lockdown. From Penn Live, sun lockdown. Is a solar minimum really going to bring famine, freezing temperatures, and droughts to Earth? From the sun has gone into a period of lockdown, which could cause freezing weather, earthquakes, and famine, say scientists. Of course, Michael Schneider on Zero Hedge, the same sort of a thing, mentioning that it will contribute to global food shortages. But then yesterday, a response in yet new headlines seemed to answer last week's call from Fox here. Yes, the sun may be heading towards a less active phase, but it won't cause a mini ice age, according to NASA. And Fox wasn't alone in printing this. From Science Alert, yes, a solar minimum is coming. No, it's not going to mess up the world. Well, which is it? Media. What's the real story here? Because some of you are telling us one thing and some of you are telling us another altogether. How can you be so inconsistent? Oh, wait, this is what we always get around these kinds of talking points. I mean, the virus alone is a ridiculous example of how the CDC says, you don't need to wear masks. It's not going to help anyway. But now that we're reopening, you're all going to have to wear a mask or you can't leave your home, right? Yes, the virus lives on surfaces for 3, 6, 10, 7 days. I'm not really quite sure. No, actually, today, CDC now issues new guidance. It doesn't really spread that easily via surfaces. Well, which is it? People are left wondering, and they don't have any authoritative source to give them the truth. And so most people, not this audience I know, just give up. They don't have time, they don't have energy, they have to go to work, whatever the case is. They can't get an answer, and so they stop searching. And that's really unfortunate, because this is a media operation that is designed, it is engineered through those media talking points to muddy the waters and keep people guessing. So let's return to that question. Why would Forbes suggest that a solar minimum is something to be feared in the first place? To answer that question, we need to understand what a solar minimum is. And I don't just mean the low periods of activity every 11 years. This 11-year regular heartbeat of the sun is called the Schwab cycle. And that's good. It usually happens. This is sort of what it is in a normal time. There are also times, though, when there are extended, amplified areas. Those are called grand maximums, where you get a little bit more activity than you normally would during the Schwab cycle. And so, too, are there periods of muted activity, where even during the maximum, it just stays pretty quiet. Or even more severely, where it just drops off, and you don't even have the 11-year heartbeat at all. It's just totally quiet, as it was, you can see here, during the Maunder minimum. Well, this is only 200 and 400 years ago, these grand minimums, respectively. And so we can look at the records of what happened during those times and sort of figure out what we should be expecting to happen now. I won't go in this video into why the sun has this behavior. I have a video that I put out 2.5 years ago called Fake Science, Grand Solar Minimum, 5-minute intro to the literature that explores the movement around the barycenter of our solar system and the fact that the velocity seems to correspond with the solar activity. It also has to do perhaps with the position of the Jovians. There's a number of different theories that are explored in this video, but it really doesn't matter. The bottom line is that when the sun goes into these grand minimums, things change on our planet, and they do so in ways that affect our life. And so let's look back briefly at the Dalton minimum, where we have records from, Lewis and Clark, who are on their expedition across North America trying to map things out. And we have records from their journals as they traversed America, talking about ridiculous colds and high winds, huge hailstorms that killed people when huge stones fell on their heads, and of course massive crop losses. I'll come back to Lewis and Clark because Thomas Jefferson himself also spoke to this. In one of his letters, he said in 1816, "We've had the most extraordinary year of drought and cold ever known in the history of America." In other words, it was unprecedented in those times. He goes through some of the droughts and then concludes, the corn crop throughout the Atlantic states will probably be less than a third of what it usually is. And tobacco's even worse hit. In other words, the bottom line was massive crop losses. And as I said, Lewis and Clark encountered cold temperatures. They spent 146 days in North Dakota and witnessed brutal air temperatures frequently well below zero, sometimes as low as minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit or more. Well, that's pretty balmy, even for North Dakota. And they documented, as I said, other things like massive hailstorms that killed people. And so that's the Dalton minimum, the most recent occurrence. When we look even further back, we can find, say, during the Wolf minimum, that there was a great famine of 1315 to 1317 in Europe. It kicked off in the spring of 1315 when unusually heavy rain began throughout much of Europe. And then in the spring and the summer, it just kept raining. It didn't ever warm up. It remained cool. What happened? Well, the grain couldn't ripen. Crops didn't grow. So they couldn't feed their animals, and the price of food and meat began to rise. And, cut to the chase here, a number of people died. Millions of people died across Europe. It took years for them to rebuild their food production and their food supply chain, and then for the population to start rebuilding itself. That was during the Wolf minimum. And if we look back still further, then what we see is that these periods of grand solar minimums correspond with big changes, not just geophysically on this planet, but in terms of human activity and civilization itself. Empires fall when their crops fail. Chinese dynasties fall and are replaced with the next one during these grand solar minimums. Because when there's no food, well, the king loses his divine right to rule, and they behead him and bring in a new empire. So these are something significant that we should absolutely be paying attention to. From, then, these periods of recorded history when the sun has been in a grand minimum, we can glean what happens. We can look at those records and sort of understand what the symptoms, as we'll call it here, are of drastically reduced solar activity. And very briefly, those are increased seismic activity and volcanic activity, the massive hailstorms we were talking about, the precipitative extremes on both sides, meaning massive torrential rainstorms that bring huge floods, but also droughts and periods where they don't get any rain whatsoever. The growing season becomes less consistent. There are temperature extremes as well. And all of this contributes then, again, to the bottom line, which is huge crop losses and food shortages and people dying, people starving. That's what happens when the sun enters a grand minimum. Are we experiencing these things right now, given that we're in a extended grand solar minimum right now? Absolutely we are. We've been watching this for a number of years on this channel. But even just to look back at the last week here, just setting our window at that, 2 days ago there was a massive hailstorm in Mexico where hail the size of a melon fell from the sky. This is ridiculous. It is the most visually impressive example, but there are a number of hailstorms across the world in these last few years, more than usual, and they have effects ranging from damaging structures to flattening fields of crops, which is yet another damage to agriculture. We're also seeing cold temperatures. Just this past week here in the United States, we had cold temperatures descend across much of the growing area in the middle of May, which is not exactly characteristic. May 10th through 12th got into the mid-20s for 9 hours in parts of West Michigan, which can cause real problems for crops, including apples. Apples, for example, lost about half of their crop this past weekend in those mid-May freezing temperatures. Of course, it wasn't just apples. There are a number of crops that were affected, including soybeans, which are having to be replanted across Illinois right now. A lot of the corn was okay. It's a little more hardy. But, suffice to say that cold temperatures are a problem for crops. And I'm not going to just cherry pick a cold temperature here and an ice storm there. In fact, to make sure that we get this point nailed down here, I created this tool called the Growing Degree Days tool, which you can find at iceagefarmer.com/GDD. And it lets you put in any zip code in the US or sort of click through different counties in various states and see for yourself how precipitously the temperatures dropped year over year from 2018 to 2019. It does that using a measurement known as growing degree days, which is used by a number of different people as a measurement to see how much growth you can expect from a plant based on how much heat is available to it. And what you see if you click through some of this data, any of it, all of it, is that across the entire United States, massive drop from 2018 to 2019 in the temperatures, and as a result then in the yields for crops. So if you get 20% less GDD, then you're going to get something like that, less growth out of your crops. And I also want to point out, in some cases, if your GDD totals drop below certain thresholds, that literally means that corn or whatever crop can no longer reach maturity. So a drastic drop of 20, 30, 40% of growing degree days literally directly translates to now the inability to grow the same crops you could grow last year for certain latitudes. This is the data that indicates growing zones shifting as temperatures drop. Check out this tool if you have any doubt whatsoever that we are quantitatively getting colder year over year right now as the sun drops off. As you would expect, it's common sense, but some people, given the global warming narrative, really needed to have this data thrown in their face. So there it is. I've made it available. Check it out. It's not just the cold temperatures, as we witnessed from the enumeration of the grand solar minimum symptoms. It's also very wet conditions or very dry conditions. It's been a very wet spring here in North America. This is a picture from Alberta, where the fields, much like last year, are underwater across vast swaths of our growing areas. Of course, Michigan has been receiving so much rain in this past few days here that 3 of their dams broke in the last 24 hours, and there's now massive flooding, chemical plants that are going to be flooded out, which would be, needless to say, a biohazard and a problem for crop production as well. So this is an indication that it's not just kind of wet, it is so wet that our very infrastructure is failing. It's not able to tolerate these deviations from the thresholds that we've sort of operated in for the last however many years now. And now that the sun has dropped off, no, it's totally different. Massive drops of rainfall that just bust through dams and infrastructure. Lots of our infrastructure. We've seen nuclear power plants shutting down when temperatures got too cold, but enough of that. So yes, a lot of these areas are underwater. This is in the Red River Valley, where he's saying, I'm probably not going to be able to get a crop in this year because my fields are too wet to even get in there and start planting. The Red River Valley, this is a disaster because they had a bad year last year as well. Just briefly, I want to remind you that the seed potato crop was completely lost. Thousands of seed potato acres were lost when cold temperatures and wet weather delayed the harvest for several weeks, and eventually they were just lost. It's just under snow, and the crop was destroyed. This is the same thing that happened to the sugar beets, which is why the co-ops said, forget it, we're not even going to go in there and harvest. And then the sugar producers declared force majeure, and then we started experiencing sugar shortages. And that happened right as the food supply chain started to get shaken up by the virus. Which is, again, the interlinking between these two things, the coronavirus lockdown and the solar lockdown, the grand solar minimum. How interesting it is that the language, the semiotics used there in that headline language conflated these two things, mixed them together as if we were really headed for some serious problems with our food supply due to the confluence of these things. And yes, I believe we are. It's also why the Red River Valley and the north growing areas there were unable to get their dry beans produced because of freeze damage in key seed-producing areas of Wyoming and untimely wet conditions in Idaho. We didn't get a lot of the dry beans. Mexico had problems as well. And so there's a seed shortage this year, which means it's going to be a problem this year as well. These are mounting problems because you can't just paper over food shortages, seed shortages, crops stuck in the fields. These are real problems that you can't print money to solve them. That's why their contingency plan this year, sadly, is to panic, because farmers have already been squeezed so hard between these crop losses, between the economic warfare that has been, and I use that word deliberately, that has been waged by banks, and the trade war, the policies that have been squeezing them harder and harder. And now last year, there's severe crop losses, and a lot of them had to take out loans even just to try and get a crop in the ground this year. And so if their crop failures this year are going to result in them losing their farms to the banks, and it's going to be a disaster. And I'm really hoping that's not going to happen, even though it's playing out. We're watching it. This is not just a United States, North America problem. This is a global, obviously, when the sun goes quiet, that's a global situation. You can see, again, just within the last few days here, in large parts of Hungary, nighttime temperatures fell to the minus range in recent weeks in mid-May. This has had a serious impact, needless to say, on the growth of stone fruits. We're expecting harvests to fall for stone fruits 70, 80%. That's a massive, obviously, that's a massive decline. And I won't go into any more of these because I think you're getting the picture. And if you're not, again, I've created a tool because some people really need I am one of these people. I really need the data. And so to help out people who really need the data, I was compiling these multi-$100 million crop losses and then eventually billion-dollar crop losses into this tool, the map.iceagefarmer.com Grand Solar Minimum Crop Loss Map. And you can get a sense visually already just for the fact that these are worldwide events that are resulting from the changes in the conditions stemming from the solar minimum. Well, we heard Thomas Jefferson say that the corn crop in 1816 during the Dalton minimum was about a third of what it usually should be. Why aren't we experiencing that now? Or are we? You may have seen an interview I did with a top 1% producer here in the United States who indicated to me anonymously that there are forces within the USDA or somewhere that are trying to give the impression that everything is okay. Again, just like Forbes, who didn't want to talk about it when we set the record for low sunspot activity last year, but now that we're matching it this year, now we're going to talk about it and the famine and how we should be afraid. What changed? It was just time to roll out this new narrative. So last year, the USDA was frantically trying to hide it, and there were myriad examples of data manipulation, putting out one report one month, and then the next month they would go back and massage those numbers so that the drop-off didn't look as severe month to month. And just fraud. Let's just put it out there. They were just lying through their teeth in a number of cases. So badly, in fact, so that I asked the question, how does this end? Because they're just throwing caution into the wind. It's as if they know there will be something so severe in the near future that they don't have to even tell the truth anymore. And now, sure enough, 2020 has seen the world change so much that all of these things have just been thrown into the wind. The food supply chain is in complete chaos. And so I think it was true. The USDA was able to lie for a certain amount of time until we've reached this change in seasons, where suddenly we're going to be talking about the solar minimum, the sun lockdown, and here we are. So if we're in a solar lockdown, if there are these severe challenges to food production, what would you expect to see? If you were the powers that be and you wanted to retain control, unlike the Chinese dynasties, which every other time this has happened in history, empires have fallen, what are you going to try and do? You're going to try and front run it. You're going to try and get in front of it and crash the economy so that people are struggling just to get by and not able to react and take down your empire. And then you're going to try and lock down people in place and control them so that your empire can survive. That's what's going on now, ladies and gentlemen. We've seen severe examples of demand control go into effect. For example, you can only buy so much sugar at Costco. We talked about the sugar shortages. They put in purchase limits on sugar. They put in purchase limits on meat. They've put in a number of different rationing on potatoes even. Safeway has limits on how many potatoes I can buy right now to go plant them. So absolutely, they have already put into place restrictions and limited access to the groceries. And if you don't have limits on items, then there are often limits on how you can even get to the food, if you can even get into the grocery stores. I posed this question on twitter.com/iceagefarmer and have hundreds of responses here from people that indicate there are huge lines. Look at this. There are huge lines. It's going to take me 2 hours to even go to the grocery store. And limit 1 on meat. Just tons of different responses because some people said, I'm not seeing it, Christian. What are you talking about? Things are fine. You're losing your mind, finally. No, I'm not. Here are a number of different people that share, wherever they are geographically, different kinds of restrictions, physical access to the store, people counting how many people can get in, all sorts of different implementations, but all of them sharing, bottom line, a reduction in how much food you can get. So that's demand control. And at the same time, the government is now introducing supply control. And this should be even more concerning. This is the government taking control over the production of food. Here from a guy named Jerry Golk, is government-induced supply control in our future? And he indicates it's not even in the future, it's happening now. With our cattle harvest down 30 to 40%, the government has started implementing a fed cattle set-aside program where we feed low-calorie food, less nutritive food to our cows so that they slow down their growth. This is a way of slowing down that pipeline since the meat factories are operating at reduced capacity. We can only feed them so many cows, so we're going to try and slow everything down on the production side to correlate with those shut down meat plants. But what I want to point out here is that this expert points out this is definitely going to translate into grains as well. You can bet, quote, if things don't look so hot and China doesn't start buying, I wouldn't put it past Trump administration to do something in the supply control area of grains as well. And ladies and gentlemen, when the federal government gets involved in the production, in what should be the private enterprise, the production of food, is a bad sign. So we see that they're limiting our ability to buy things and our access to food, and they're getting involved. They're taking control over the production of food itself. And I expect both of these trends to continue, but that's how you would handle yourself if you are trying to retain power of your empire during a solar lockdown. Maybe that's what Forbes was indicating they fear. Maybe the empire feels being deposed during this critical time. But whatever the case, both of these things are going on. And as a result, food is being changed, isn't it? It's being perceived as more valuable. Here, this Calgary-based truck driver was in Mississippi and was delivering a load of produce to a Walmart distribution center when the sheriff approached him and said, "Hey, we're going to give you some armed escorts for your truck of food." He said, "Why? It's crazy." "Well, we're worried that people might hijack your food and steal your truck." And so he was escorted by 2 armed deputies that stood ready for hungry people to ambush them. Quote, "Right now, produce is like gold." And if you think that's true now, ladies and gentlemen, then I think you would be surprised to imagine how it's going to look, 6 to 8 months from now, especially if we fail to get control over the crazy governors that are trying to put restrictions on harvest labor coming in. That's going to be a disaster. If we're not able to get the crops out of the ground at all, then that's the end of the story as we know it, and we're going to see drastically different world next year. But even without that, even if we do manage to kick out Governor Inslee and Governor Newsom and somehow take control back, then just the grand solar minimum itself is already spelling a difficult time for us right now. And we all need, given everything I've just talked about, to be growing our own food right now. We all need to be moving towards a distributed model of food production. And what that means in English is everybody grows food. And if someone's, gets a massive hailstorm the size of melons and it flattens your crop, well, one of your neighbors can be there with seeds to help you out. Or you guys can grow something else from another friend in another town who's got seeds for you. If everybody is growing, then you can have tons of crop failures, and it's not a big deal because we can all be there for each other. This is the way, after all, that humanity has always done it. And it's where we need to get back to. We don't need to centralize even more the production and the meat processing and the control into the hands of the powers that be. That's the wrong way to go right now. So please start growing your own food. Start working with your local farmers. I wanted to mention localharvest.org, which is a great site that has these maps of small producers. You can find farms really close to you, no matter almost where you are. And you should reach out to them while we can and form relationships and offer to help them. Go do some labor in exchange for a CSA basket, or help them with their website, or help them, whatever the case may be, whatever help you can offer them. Form those relationships now, because farmers and producers, as I've said, have been being squeezed out for a long time right now. And everything that's going on right now is as it is for everybody in this now new economic global depression we've entered. Farmers and producers especially need your help. So ladies and gentlemen, that's a lot to swallow, but I hope I've been able to answer a little bit about why suddenly the talking points went out and we have conflated the solar lockdown with the coronavirus. I mean, the semiotics just between these two terms alone are ridiculous, and it's really indicative. I mean, this is the way they play you with their Twilight language in the headlines. But even setting aside that sort of esoteric analysis, what's going on right now is clear. Food is being used as a weapon. They've announced their intention to do that, right? Between Bertrand Russell, diet, injections, and injunctions will conspire to mean that we can control the people. Between Henry Kissinger, control food, and you control the people. They've been quite open about their intention to use food as a weapon, and now they're doing it. And that's why we have to have a garden a victory garden in every household. So check out my new site, thevictoryseed.org, where I've put up some growing season maps and some instructions on how you can make potatoes and some other resources that I hope can help people get spun up really quickly right now to start growing food. And I'll leave it at there for the day. That is why the solar lockdown is in the news. Share this information with others, because it's going to take all of us working and growing and building a new system that empowers people and grows abundant food for everybody in resilient ways, so that we can get away from these terrible central controlled systems of enslavement that they would love to just march us into. Thanks for watching, ladies and gentlemen. Let's go build great things.